Right, guys, welcome to the fifth episode of the League Express podcast. My name's Jake Kearnan, and joining me as always is the League Express editor, Martyn Sadler. And Martyn, we have a special guest here today. Would you like to introduce him?
Yes, welcome Richard de la Riviere. Richard's a writer with League Express, and each week writes the Rugby League Heroes column, which is a series of interviews with great players who have, in the most part, retired now, but tell their individual stories of their careers in rugby league, and it's a very popular part of the newspaper. And as a result of that, Richard's written a new book which we're going to publish. It's out on September the 1st, called 50 Wigan Legends in Their Own Words. So 50 players who have graced the Wigan club. And Richard, you're going to be selling that book, I think, on September the 1st before Wigan's match against Salford at the DW Stadium. It's been a great book to write, and I think it'll be an even greater book to read for people who are lucky enough to buy it.
Yeah, thanks, Martyn. So Wigan have invited me down. Wigan have been great with this book, actually. They put me in touch with a fellow called Keith Such, who runs their Past Players Association, and he gave me numbers for all sorts of players from the 60s and the 70s and one or two more modern ones. The media department set me up with guys like Liam Farrell, Sean O'Loughlin, Tommy Lulaway, Shaun Wane. And the club shop have invited me down, so I'll be there for a couple of hours before kick-off on the Friday before they play Salford, with copies of the book. And if people actually want my signature in it for some reason, then they can. But yeah,
there'll be queues out the door. I'd imagine,
absolutely, yeah. So you mentioned the Rugby League Heroes thing. So some of these, about a third of these interviews in the book, about roughly a third of the 50. The interviews have already been in League Express. So like Green Vigo, Colin Clark, Phil Clark. Bill Ashurst, obviously, who's now passed away, but I interviewed him 2 or 3 years ago. Brilliant interview. Told me about his mum chasing him around the house with a poker when he said that he got engaged and got his girlfriend pregnant. Yeah. So Bill Ashurst, obviously one of the great characters. Yeah. And then about a third of them are previous interviews that I've updated. So, for example, one interview goes back to 2005, and that was one of the first I ever did. That was with Terry Newton, and I updated it by phoning Phil Wilkinson, his biographer, who told me all sorts about Terry and what he was like to work with. And then obviously I've extended the piece into talking about what happened to Terry, which obviously was a terrible story. And Phil talks about that as well. So I obviously hope I've done Terry justice there. And obviously the easiest way to update the other ones I've updated is simply by phoning the player back and asking them a lot more questions. And then about a third of them, and these tend to be the longer interviews, are brand new ones. So I've managed to get hold of people like Joe Lydon, Nicky Kiss, Kelvin Skerritt. I've got some absolutely brilliant interviews that have never been published before.
Joe Lydon's, yes, is one of the first ones in the book, isn't it?
It's the first one in the book, actually.
Outstanding interview.
The interview with Joe, I mean, it ticks every box, because Joe was a wonderful player, world class, with a really high profile at a time when we had games on the BBC all the time, and Joe was just a wonderful player, but he told me so many funny stories. And
the thing that's so apparent, Richard, from reading, I've only read part of it so far, but the thing that's so apparent is what a great sense of humour a lot of rugby league players have. They're fond of amusing stories, aren't they? And I think if you're buying this book, you want to sit down and be prepared to laugh out loud, because you will do.
Joe told me some hilarious stories. I met Joe in his office, and I can still see him now demonstrating this hilarious story that involved Andy Gregory, Jed Byrne, and a sand bucket, and he's demonstrating Jed carrying this bucket, which had secretly been filled with bricks and water, onto the field for Andy and Joe, and then them saying, we've changed our mind, we're not kicking the goal now. I won't give too many of the stories away. I won't do that, but Joe told me some absolute corkers. And Terry O'Connor told me some very funny stories, so did Martin Hall, and I reckon there are about half a dozen at least. Kelvin Skerritt, some brilliant stories. Nicky Kiss, I won't give too much away, but Nicky Kiss tells a story of sitting on the toilet at Central Park and shouting, can someone send me a pen? And someone puts a pen under the door, and he writes on a bit of toilet roll, I, Nicky Kiss, want to transfer, signs it, dates it, takes it to the chairman, hands it over, and he says, Nicky, what's all this about? Why do you want to transfer? And he just says, because of him. And he pointed at Alex Murphy, who was just sitting there staring at the ground, and Kiss just delivered this monologue about how he hated Murphy and walked out of the club. And then a few months later, Murphy gets the sack and Nicky Kiss comes back. It's actually pronounced Kish, by the way. It's,
Is it? Right.
He's
Hungarian.
Hungarian. So I never thought I'd write about the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, but Nicky's mum and dad came over as refugees separately to Manchester, and they met each other, got together, and they moved to Oldham, where Nicky took up rugby league with Saddleworth, and then he signed for Wigan. So incredible how some people become rugby league players. But Nicky's just one of a great story, and I loved speaking to him.
Before we sort of get into it a little bit more, we will remind our listeners and viewers that if you do want a copy of this book, you can go onto the Total RL website. So that's www.totalrl.com/shop, or you can call 01484 401 895. That's 01484 401 895 to secure your copy. Now, you mentioned you're going to be doing a bit of a meet and greet in a couple of weeks' time. Will that be on September 1st?
Yeah, so September the 1st at Wigan. That's right, before their game against Salford.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, perfect. And when did this idea spring to mind? When did you start getting the wheels in motion for this book?
Well, as I said, I wrote the first one in 2005, but about maybe 3 years ago, something like that, just out of interest, I thought, I wonder how many Wigan legends I've interviewed and how many Leeds legends and how many Saints legends. And I was well into the 30s for both clubs. And then as you start playing around, thinking, well, if I get hold of him, and then I'll have an absolutely excellent book. So maybe further down the line, I'll produce the same book for Leeds and St Helens. But it just so happened that it's Wigan first. But yeah, there's interviews in there that will have been read by a reasonable number of people at the time that I just want to get out there again. For example, in 2008, I got a sit-down one-on-one for 1 hour with Ellery Hanley, and I don't know how much you know about him, but that's very rare because he didn't speak to journalists when he played.
No,
I'm sure.
One of his best quotes is about journalists.
Yeah,
isn't it?
I remember you picked that out at the time as the League Express quote of the week. And I said to Ellery in this interview, I knew I was probably skating on thin ice, so I said, so why didn't you talk to journalists? And he just looked at me very calmly, and he just said, but I just think that you journalists don't know what you're talking about. You've never crossed the white line. How can you possibly, any member of the public can do that? I've just got no respect whatsoever for your views. And I'm sitting as close to him as I am to you now, sort of, trying to think, well, I hope I get through this interview. But I remember thinking before I went in, if I change the subject to him playing for Balmain Tigers in '88, that'll put a smile on his face. And I had to use that card very, very quickly, much quicker than I anticipated. But it was a brilliant interview, and he was on great form. And I got in because he got the Doncaster job. And obviously there was going to be an obligation on him to do some media, so I made the request and I got it, and he answered everything, and I got an hour with him, and it was a brilliant interview. There was a writer a few years ago wrote a book on Wigan winning 8 in a row, the 8 Challenge Cups in a row, and he rang me up and he said, I've just found your Ellery Hanley interview. Do you mind if I quote from it? Because I've never seen an Ellery Hanley interview before.
Yeah.
So it's pretty unique, so I'm very proud of it. I've updated it with all his career details, so it makes for a pretty solid biography of what he achieved. And as I've written in it, I think he may well be the greatest British rugby league player of all time. Martin will tell me it's Neil Fox. Somebody might say it's Alex Murphy, but I think there's a big 4 or 5, and I think Ellery's in it. And I would argue that Ellery played in an era where the Aussies were a lot better than us, and he didn't just go toe-to-toe with them. He was at times better than those guys, particularly in '88 when he went to play for Balmain and he single-handedly took them to the grand final. I think there were long periods of time when Ellery was probably the best player in the world. He might have won 1 golden boot, but
so dedicated, wasn't he?
3-4 month periods, and he stood out in a way. I don't think it's possible for players now to stand out so much more above everybody else in certain ways, but Ellery was athletic in a way that other players weren't, and lifting weights and doing stuff with medicine balls, and professional in a way that just other people weren't. He wasn't drinking when others were, so he just stood out. But he stood out above Australians and Kiwis, who are just generational greats. I mean, there was a big 4 or 5 in the mid to late 80s, wasn't there, in the world of sort of Lewis, Kenny, Sterling, Meninga, and Hanley was in that. And I think Hanley was towards the top of that, or at the top of that, for longer periods than you'd think. I could happily argue that he's the greatest British rugby league player of all time.
if you can cast your mind back to that moment where you're sitting in the room with him, how intimidating was it when he opened with that, and how did you respond?
I didn't go completely to pieces. I think you've got to be able to hold your own, and I think,
You did tell him that you had played with Heysham Atoms, didn't you?
Well, I haven't actually played with
I thought you had.
Masters.
No, Lancaster, was it?
No, but I've played about 5 games of rugby league in my life. I played a little bit at university.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't tell him that, and I'm not sure it would cut any ice with Ellery. But yeah, I mean, you also have to think, compared to now, the profile that he had. I mean, he went on Wogan, and he was signed by an American football club called the London Monarchs. He never played for them, but they did it as a publicity stunt to launch themselves. They did. And it caused quite some consternation in rugby league, because he was suddenly out there on Wogan, that's why he went on Wogan, to talk about American football. And people thought, well, why wouldn't he do that at rugby league? And look, it wasn't ideal that he wouldn't talk about rugby league, but because he was the only one doing it, it sort of added to his...
Mystique.
Yeah, I was going to say
no doubt.
But mystique is a much better word. It did. It added to... It wouldn't be ideal if more did it, but it just added to who he was, and what a player.
And that's really interesting you say that, because, we always tend to say rugby league is a great game because the players are so approachable compared to soccer, for example. But actually, when a player isn't approachable, as Ellery wasn't for a long time, particularly by the media, it actually adds something rather than take something away, doesn't it? Or it did in his case.
I think it did with
Ellery. As long as it goes with brilliant talent.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if an ordinary, kid who's a reserve grader somewhere tried to do that, it wouldn't count. But when you're such a great player, there's a sense in which fans like players to be a bit distant from them, really.
Yeah, the strange thing is, it didn't, as I say, it didn't harm him, and even now, because the game's profile has sunk so much in the modern era, him and Martyn Sadler probably have a bigger profile than players of the last 25 years. And that in a way, that's sad, but it shows that him and his approach didn't do him any harm. And then by extension, people would have been coming to Wigan or Leeds or whoever to watch him play. I don't think it did harm. But on the other hand, I wasn't a journalist in the 1980s desperately trying to get an Ellery Hanley interview. I stumbled across him once and managed to get very lucky, and the interview's in the book.
It makes you wonder, now that times have changed and we have the new age of social media, how a Hanley would go in today's day and age with all the cameras on our smartphones and people coming up for comment everywhere.
Yeah, he's obviously not on social media. I couldn't imagine that. But I mean, I don't think he was particularly keen on selfies, and selfies didn't exist then, but on signing things. I think he was just like that. It wasn't just with journalists. I think with fans. I mean, Gary Schofield claims to have never turned down an autograph request, but not all players were like that, I think.
No, I mean, I still see Ellery occasionally because his lawyer is somebody who I know quite well in Leeds, and I've occasionally attended seminars that Ellery's been present at too. And he's a great guy. You couldn't be a nicer guy as far as I'm concerned. Always speaks, always very pleasant, always, listens to what you say. And I remember at one time he complimented me, this was many years ago, by saying that my column in League Express was the one column he always read. And he'd no reason to say that, frankly, but...
we'll get that on your headstone.
Yeah,
there's no big...
I don't know whether he'd still read it now. Probably not. Who knows? But I was sort of walking on air for a while after that.
The thing is, he's actually one of the big losses to rugby league coaching, because he in his first season as a head coach at St Helens, he won the Super League title, and they'd been miles off the pace in 98, and they won it. And that grand final against Bradford in 99, that was state of origin intensity. It was an incredible game, and he got them up to that level. But within 3 months, he was out the door, and he's never coached in Super League since.
I'll tell you a little story about that grand final as well, which you might find quite interesting, Richard. Prior to, if you remember, in the lead up to the grand final, in one of the preceding playoff games, Bradford had beaten St Helens 42-6. They'd beaten them very easily, and they were up against them in the grand final. And I wrote in League Express, the Bradford team are going to be coming into this game with enormous confidence because they all think the St Helens pack is a bit soft. And Ellery read that and put that article up in the St Helens dressing room and said, to the players, this guy thinks you're you're all soft, basically. Are you going to show us what you really like? And in the press conference after that grand final, when they'd beaten Bradford, he actually pointed to me, and Chris joined. It's funny because Ellery sort of looked at me and said, your article helped us win. And Chris joined, who was the captain, looked at me and actually was very angry about what I'd written,
Right, wow.
But it did motivate them to beat Bradford. So, my response was, I ought to be uncommissioned for having written that, really.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So you weren't invited to the post-match celebrations, mate?
It's fantastic. But what a shame Ellery hasn't carried on coaching.
Oh, great shame. Yeah.
But going back to the media thing, I do wonder his sort of inability to deal with the media, I think, potentially cost him, because it was a problem. He couldn't do it, could he?
No, but the thing is, in 2000, he won the grand final in 1999, lost the World Club Challenge to Melbourne Storm in 2000, which was played at Wigan.
Yeah.
And then a few weeks after that, he actually got in touch with us, and he was very angry about the St Helens directors at the time. There was something they were doing. He felt that they weren't supporting him, and he wanted to make a stand, and he actually got in touch and said, and gave a statement and said, this is just not good enough.
Just to correct you slightly, he did that the season before, halfway through, and they suspended him for it, and then he came back. They then embarked on an incredible run-in when he came back for a game against Leeds. And then this was the following season. They lost the first three, including to Melbourne. And then I think the directors hadn't quite forgiven him for that.
No, maybe not. Well, maybe I'm getting the time scale wrong.
I think they then found some other reasons to sack him. But 4 games ago, he'd won the Super League Grand Final trophy.
Amazing.
And it's just... Maybe if he'd got the Wigan job with Morris there, it could have been different. Maybe Morris would have known how to handle him, so to speak. But
anyway, we shouldn't just talk about Ellery. There are 49 other players in the book.
And you sent me through a few copies over email, Richard. Bill Ashurst, what can you tell me about him?
Well, Bill Ashurst, I think, was named an all-time Penrith Panthers team. Just one of the great... And I think if you named an all-time Wigan team, I think he'd be in that as well. He was just a phenomenal player. And man of the match by some distance in the 1971 Championship final, which Wigan fans haven't forgotten because they were winning, and St Helens scored 2 tries right at the end, one of which was a complete fluke that was, by all accounts, a long way offside, a drop goal from the touchline, which went nowhere near. And Billy Benyon, who I recently interviewed in the Rugby League Heroes section, managed to get there first and score a try. But Bill Ashurst that day, by all accounts, was absolutely fantastic. A real character. Again, a brilliant story, this. Bill ended up coaching... Well, he finished at Wakefield, didn't he, Martyn?
So he did, yes. Played in the 1979 Challenge final.
So his last game in Rugby League for Wakefield was about 83, 84. And then he coached Runcorn, and they got drawn against Wigan. This is one of my favourite ever stories. They got drawn against Wigan in a Regal Trophy match, possibly a Lancashire Cup match. And the Runcorn players all said, well, we want more money because you're going to be getting 50% of the gate. We all want more money. And the club said, no, we're not going to give you more money. So the entire Runcorn team went on strike. So they had to go and sign basically a whole amateur team from Widnes to come in and play the game. And Bill Ashurst, not having played for 5 years, puts himself on the bench. He then comes on, and after a few minutes, he headbutts Andy Goodway and gets sent off. And Runcorn lose 92-2. Yeah. And this is one of my favourite ever stories. So, of course, I ask about that in the book. And he became a born-again Christian, and he said, look, I'm so sorry. I did things like that, and I hit people. I think he broke someone's jaw. And he said, I'm so sorry that I ever did things like that. But that Runcorn story... were absolutely fantastic. And when I said that all the first team had stood down, John Cogger was the only one who couldn't. The great Australian John Cogger, you might be familiar with, whose nephew's in the NRL now. Well, he had to play because he was contracted, and they said, we'll tear your visa up and you have to go back home if you don't play. So all the other Runcorn players who were on strike were stood behind the post shouting scab at John Cogger, because every 60 seconds they were behind the post for another Wigan convert. That Wigan Runcorn game throws up 2 of my favourite ever stories, and that's both of them. But Bill Ashurst, that's genuine. I mean, he went to Penrith with Steve-O, and by all accounts they didn't get on. But I've seen suggestions that they were a bit closer than that. You know,
I think I read, was it something to do with them playing on the media as well? Like they sort of misled the media a little bit too.
I think so.
Well, I think Steve always used to accuse Bill of not taking training very seriously.
Right.
And Bill's response was, well, what does that matter if I create 3 tries every week?
Yeah.
Which he did do.
But he was the sort of forward that we don't see now with the sort of hands.
And a great boot. I mean, when he played for Wakefield, he was playing on one leg, really, but his ability to kick a ball was incredible.
But he played in a relatively unhappy era for Wigan because, of course, in the 70s they'd fallen away from the great team of the 60s, and it was far too early for the glory years of the mid 80s onwards. Mm-hmm. And I managed to get quite a few from the 70s. Actually, Wigan had some very charismatic guys with amazing stories. I got one with John Gray, who went to the top in 3 different sports. He started off as a county cricketer with Warwickshire, bowled out the England captain, I think, on his debut, and then he switched to rugby union, played twice for England, and then he switched to rugby league for Wigan, played for Great Britain within 6 months, and then went to Australia. And I think he was also named in the North Sydney Bears all-time 17. And John Gray's story are just absolutely fantastic. And they also had Green Vigo, one of my favourite interviews.
He was in touch with Green Vigo, didn't he?
Yeah, well, about 5 people were working on Green for about a year and eventually persuaded... I was a little bit embarrassed because I was thinking, the poor guy doesn't want to do an interview. But John just sort of kept trying.
I'll tell you something, Richard. It would be great to see Green Vigo at Wigan again. I wonder if we could persuade him to come and join you on September the 1st. Because, I mean, he was a hero. I mean, it was Green Vigo's interview is absolutely fascinating because it's a black South African player who played at the time of apartheid in South Africa, and I think it's really quite moving, his story, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. I mean, he talks about Bill Ashurst. He talked about Bill as though he was talking to Bill, saying, I love you, Bill, I miss you, Bill, I'm so sorry I didn't go to your funeral, that sort of thing, And Green led an extraordinary life and was very good friends with John Gray because they signed at the same time, and they said, they'd go to the pub and Green wouldn't go in. He'd just say, oh, just bring me a beer out, because black men weren't allowed to go into the pub in apartheid South Africa. And it took him a long time to sort of transition, but whilst Wigan bought gave John Gray a lovely house, Green was just in digs. But again, a really funny story about how he walked in and turned Tommy Cooper off the television, and his landlady shouted at him, you don't turn Tommy Cooper off the television. The cultural differences here are just off the charts. But like I say, what a brilliant winger. There was a game when they went to Leeds and he was up against John Atkinson and he scored a hat-trick, and I think that was one of the reasons why John ended up retiring. And of course, John Atkinson is one of the greatest wingers that's ever lived. Yeah. And Green one day scored 7 against St Helens. But again, like all the guys in the 70s, he played in an era where things had started to go wrong for the club.
I can only imagine some of the backstories you would have heard that, we see these footballers week in and week out on the field and on TV, and you think that's who they are, but I guess it would have been a real treat being able to hear some of the personal stories with some of the players you interviewed for this book.
Well, that's it. It's very rare when you interview rugby league players, past rugby league players, the walls come down when they're past players, which is why I prefer interviewing past players. But it's very rare that I ask something and there's a bit of awkwardness because they don't want to talk about it. So, whatever it is, they generally will talk about it. And some people will sort of offer you an insight that you're not really expecting, and will go into depths that you're not really expecting. And I love it. I'll happily just, whatever they say, even if the subject goes away from rugby league for a few minutes, just talking about personal issues, then fine. But the people who I interviewed tend to be just so open, because I think a lot of these guys have never really had much media attention, probably didn't at the time anyway. Maybe the captain or the star player would have done, but rugby league being a much smaller sport, maybe not too much. And then since they finished playing, they've probably never really had interview requests.
I think the thing probably is that a lot of players like to think that they've not been forgotten.
Yeah,
and you coming on the phone to them and so on, and either meeting them or whatever, it's a sign that they've not been, and I think that's really great.
Is there any player that you've gone into the interview thinking, all right, this is how it's going to go, I know a little bit about their story, and then they've just completely shocked you with what they've had to tell you about their life story?
Well, to a degree, Sam Tomkins shocked me by being such a good interviewee, because what I just said about current players not being so good, Tomkins was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, and just told me some hilarious stories and was so easy to talk to, and he was so calm and relaxed, just an absolute natural. And I only really interview past players. I don't have a Super League press pass. I don't meet these guys. I don't see them in the mix zone. And I just sort of had this idea that he's someone who's probably badgered by the media and won't say too much, and he could not have been any different to that. So he'd be the best example of an interview that went totally different to what I thought it would be, and in a really good way.
Well, just reading the passage you sent me on Sam Tomkins, I didn't know sort of not the struggle, but how long it took him to get that chance to make his debut at the professional level.
It's a great story, isn't it? Because I've been guilty of watching academy games in the past where I've really thought that guy's going to go on and be the next Lee Crooks, or that guy's going to be the next Martyn Sadler, and then they never play for the first team. It's partly because they don't get an opportunity. So Sam Tomkins had to wait for Tim Smith to break his arm, Tim Smith being the ex-Parramatta standoff. But even in the academy, Shaun Wane didn't trust him, didn't think he was big enough. So he was a substitute in an academy semi-final, and a brawl broke out. And Wigan had won this game, and then half their team got suspended. So he said he's standing there as a substitute, really chuffed that this brawl's happening because it means there's going to be suspension. He's going to play.
Yeah.
And then he also said how he just spent an off-season going back to the amateur game, and he just sort of needed that as well. But I occasionally do wonder how many kids, if something very slightly different happens, could just make it as an absolute star, but they just don't quite get one break. And I think Tomkins is absolute proof of that. I also loved his opinions on Wayne Bennett. I'm not sure if they've been made public, but he just said it was a really poor appointment, and Bennett never tried to really integrate himself into it, and he'd be on a big screen from 12,000 miles away. The internet would trip out. He said it was just rubbish. He said it was just a poor appointment, and that sort of honesty. When you interview current players, it's hard to get that sort of stuff out of them.
It's very interesting, that, isn't it? The Wayne Bennett situation with England and Great Britain, because Kevin Sinfield was the bloke who I think was the primary mover in getting Wayne appointed. And when Wayne's services were no longer required, I think Kevin walked away from the game. Right. He was very disappointed by that. And it's probably why he ended up in rugby union now, you know, going to a rugby union World Cup. But it sort of shows a diametrical opposite, doesn't it, between him and Sam Tomkins.
Well, JB Peacock in League Express during the World Cup was writing a column, wasn't he? And he was adamant that Bennett was, you know, that Shaun Wane hadn't lived up to Wayne Bennett because Wayne didn't get to the final and Bennett did. But on the subject of Shaun Wane, that was another great interview. So I mean, his life story is incredible. I didn't get this as an exclusive because he's told this story before. He was often abused really by his dad in a sort of a disciplinary way, beaten and such like. And he talks a bit more about that, and he just has an incredible life story, and his journey to becoming a coach. Again, how many people are lost to the game? I mean, Shaun was working as a tarmacker, and he'd spend his lunchtime preparing rugby league videos for training sessions on his laptop as a tarmacker, earning £100 a day. And he just went up the ladder at Wigan quite slowly, but over a period of 10, 15 years, and then becomes an assistant coach. And I remember when Michael Maguire left, Ian Lenigan made him sweat. There was a long wait before Wayne was appointed, and it made you think, is Lenigan looking elsewhere? Does he want another Aussie? And eventually Wayne got the job, and he's one of my favourite coaches. I love, there's a story again of, he used to make his academy players turn up with a filofax for no reason. There was nothing in them. But his thinking was, if you can't remember to bring your filofax, you don't have what it takes. And this poor kid kept forgetting his filofax, so he just chucked him out.
It wasn't Sam Tomkins, was it?
No, it wasn't.
No.
But Shaun, I love speaking to Shaun, and just about, culture is a very overused word, and it's used by coaches sometimes, and I don't really think they know what it means, but Shaun clearly does. And he talks about what he wants from his players. And Shaun's interview in this book is a really interesting insight into that. And so is Shaun Edwards, actually. That's another. I love speaking to Shaun Edwards because you feel like you're learning with every answer. Have you picked that up from?
Oh yes,
before, Martyn. You do. You just feel privileged to talk to him because you feel like you're learning. And interviewing Shaun was great. It's a very big interview with Shaun Edwards. I've sort of merged two old interviews together.
I'll tell you a little story about Shaun, because back in the early 1980s, I was involved with Peter Deakin, the great Peter Deakin, who's not been with us, sadly, for many, many years now. But we set up an organisation that was called BUSCALA. The acronym was BUSCALA, British Upper Schools and Colleges Amateur Rugby League Association. And basically, it was an organisation that promoted rugby league in sixth form colleges and sixth forms of schools, because it was a gap between the English Schools Rugby League and the University Rugby League. So, to cut a long story short, Shaun was 16 at the time, and was a pupil at St John Rugby College in Wigan. And we selected a team to tour Australia, and Shaun was one of the players selected. But the problem was, when he got to Australia, the first thing he did was injure his knee and couldn't play any games. So what then happened was that, all the lads who were fit were playing these games, and between games were going to Bondi Beach or wherever it might be to, on nights out or days out or whatever. They were all obviously determined to have a great time, as kids would. But Shaun, instead of doing any of that, he spent every day going to a different rugby league club in Sydney to watch them training. And he took his notebook with him and just took notes on each club that he went to.
That's amazing, isn't it, for a 16-year-old?
16-year-old.
He also played England Schools Rugby League and Rugby Union simultaneously.
I saw him play.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
I saw him play Rugby Union for Lancashire Schools against Yorkshire in Wakefield when he was 16. And the story at that time was that he'd never played a game of Rugby Union before, and yet they made him the captain of Lancashire Schools, and he led them out, with that incredible frown on his face. When he was concentrating, he had that amazing frown, and he led them out and led them to victory against.
I think he captained.
Against Yorkshire.
I think he captained the England team as well, and he said he played in the centres with Richard Gunn, who was another.
Yeah, Richard Gunn was playing for Yorkshire that day as well.
But in terms of Shaun leading his teams onto the field, when he actually got sent off in this game at Wembley, of course, against the Aussies, so it might not be the best example, but the look on his face when he takes Great Britain out, absolutely just amazing.
Yes,
he's just seems somewhat angry and focused in one. Just what a leader, what a captain as well. But of course, not too popular at Wigan anymore because of
no.
But I think what happened worked out in the best for everybody. I think both parties blamed each other.
Yeah.
But I think it was perhaps a sentimental appointment.
What Richard's talking about there, Jack, just in case you don't know, is that Shaun was going to become the Wigan coach following Adrian Lamb at Wigan, but it fell through for some reason, and he carried on in Rugby Union.
I interviewed him at the time, and he said, look, everyone's going to ask you this question, but you'll have been out of the game for 20 years, and you never actually coached really in Rugby League officially. And he said, yeah, but you just get good assistance, Richard, and you can catch up quickly. And I didn't find that a convincing answer, whereas Shaun is a convincing guy in every respect, but I wasn't sure that it was going to work, and I think it's probably worked out best for everybody. But I think there's a bit of bad blood there with fans and Shaun, which is a shame, given everything that he did for the club. He was the ultimate legend at one club.
The thing about Shaun as well is that, there's that statue of 5 players at Wembley, and he should have been in it, because nobody has won more games at Wembley than he has.
Than Shaun.
Not just for Wigan, but for Great Britain and England and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
He's very rarely lost a game. He lost with London Broncos in 1999, right at the last game he ever played at Wembley.
He lost in '84, but you're right. The '92 World Cup final.
The first game, game and the last game he played there.
He'd have won the best part, but Andy Gregory would have won a similar number because he won there with Widnes, didn't he? So I think Andy won about 8, but Shaun probably more because he'd won the 8 in a row. And then at least 2 with Great Britain.
Yeah.
So he'd have had 10 wins at Wembley off the top of my head. Yeah, that is amazing. But there's so many people who deserve to be on it.
Oh gosh, Neil Fox, for example. Yeah.
Now, with a lot of your interviews, I sort of look at the book as I can't imagine there'd be much negative said about playing for Wigan. But were there any players interviewed who there has been a bit more bad blood or a bit of a severed relationship?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought that up because there are a few, and I did think to myself, if this was an in-house production from Wigan, they might not have sort of wanted some of this, and they've not actually asked me, so but nothing too bad. But the great Frank Parr, the scrum half in the 60s, talks about how he was essentially forced out. Gemma Walsh, who captained Wigan in the first women's season, she said that the club invested a lot in the women's team in 2018, but it's totally let it slide in 2019, and she was critical of the club for that. So there's 2 examples. There will be more, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But I mean, obviously, Nicky Kiss blows the lid on troubles at the time, but with a particular coach. But then obviously Murphy left and all was well again. Steve Hampson was forced out before his testimonial because he had to play 10 years to get testimonial. They forced him out after something like 9 years and 8 months or something, just as his wife had given birth, and that led to Salford beating Wigan in the Cup in '96, the first Cup game they'd lost in 9 years, and Hampson going up to the director's box from the pitch and just shouting up at Jack Robinson, and just incredible scenes that they must have been. So he talks about that. So there's bits and pieces. There's always going to be disgruntled players. I mean, Dennis Betts talks about coaching, which didn't go great, and of course they brought Millward in, which he was upset about in 2004-05. So there's a reasonable amount of that in there. Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's quite a lengthy list, but are there any players who had, unfortunately passed before you were able to get an interview from them that you wish could have been included, but unfortunately, due to circumstances, can't be?
Yeah, I think if 3 or 4 years ago I'd had the idea of this book, and I'd sort of become very focused on I want to get as many Wigan legends as I can. I'd have tried to get Dave Bolton, who went to play for Balmain, man of the match in the '69 grand final, and Dave, I think Paul Sirenen. He's friends with Scoey, and I think I could have probably got in touch with him because he used to do the past players. So I think I could have got Dave Bolton, and just didn't in time. So no, I mean occasionally, great rugby league player passes away. I sometimes think, well, but didn't happen to speak to.
Is there still any Wigan player who's still alive who isn't included in the book who you'd really quite like to get if you're doing another one?
I couldn't get Andy Farrell for love nor money.
Couldn't you?
I tried. I'd tried to get him about 3 years ago for a Rugby League Heroes interview in League Express, and just the Irish Rugby Union just weren't helpful. I mean, 2 years in a row they said come back at the end of the Six Nations, and I said, well, you said that last year, And then a couple of Farrell's ex-teammates at Wigan tried on my behalf, but I mean, look, he's just about to go into a World Cup coaching the favourites. I've got no problem. If I wanted to write this same book on, say, Liverpool, who I support, I wouldn't get anywhere, would I?
No.
I'd have to pay a fortune. None of these have been paid for, by the way. They're all people who are happy to give up their time for nothing. If I wanted to write the same book on Liverpool, it would be a non-starter unless I had an absolute fortune to play with. So I'm very, very grateful for the 50 that I've got. I mean, tried to get John Ferguson. I did eventually get through to him on the phone, but he's never done a media interview in his life. But I hoped, but I didn't. I wasn't successful. Brian Carney said no. He was incredibly friendly, and he set me up with Terry O'Connor. But he just sort of, he very, very modestly said that he didn't think he was a Wigan legend, which I don't agree with, of course.
No.
But yeah, and I've tried to get others for League Express interviews who maybe then I would have used in this, like Steve Renoff, and I think So I didn't get everyone, but I think the 50 that I put out there, I'll defend. I'll happily argue that
they're 50 great ones. Yeah.
But that's the other thing. It's not just the quality of the player; it's the quality of the interview. And you want someone. If someone doesn't want to do it, then that implies that if they get talked into it, that they might just not open up that much.
But Green Vigo didn't want to, did he? At first?
Yeah, exactly.
But his is brilliant.
But when he came back to me, he just said, "You can ask me anything, and I'll answer it."
I would. I mean, Green Vigo's interview is worth the money alone, in my view.
Oh, it was a stunning interview, wasn't it? So, he told me because he vanished from the scene and he was drinking heavily and wasn't looking after himself. The South African newspapers reported that he died. It was incredible. And then he said he'd been sober now for 25 years and lovely story.
He would have, if it hadn't been for apartheid, he would have been the first black player to play rugby union for South Africa, and he would have been a great player, great rugby union player. Wow. And as it turned out, he came over here and, was... I remember watching him when he first came, and I remember him signing with John Gray. And in those days, they played something called the Wills Sevens tournament at the start of the season. And it was the first time that Green Vigo had stepped onto a rugby league pitch, and he scored a bucket full of tries. And the Wigan fans reacted to him as the new Billy Boston, which he looked like at the time. It was... And of course that was a hard label to live up to, but he was a great player.
We see it in all sports. I mean, how many next George Best did Man United have? How many next Peter Sterlings have Paramount had? But and Wigan have had a incredible history of great black wingers, but he was the one who just played in an era where they weren't successful and he didn't really win much. And he's another example of that question that you asked about. He wasn't treated particularly well by the club. I don't think he was paid particularly well, and not looked after in a great way. But what a story he's got.
Yeah. Now, two-part question here. Who is your favourite Wigan player of all time, and who is your favourite interview out of all the players you interviewed?
Well, I'm not actually a Wigan fan, so my favourite interview. Oh, it's too difficult, that.
Maybe with top three.
Yeah, well,
that makes it easier.
I'll go with Vigo, Leiden, and Kiss or Skerritt. One of those two, I think. I really don't want to offend anyone who, but they're three. I mean, Dennis Betts was a great interview, but no, I think those Kiss maybe third. Favourite Wigan player of all time. I mean, through the glory years, I'd probably. I was going to say Sean Edwards. I might go for Gary Connolly. He was incredibly underrated. I've got Paul Newlove interviewed in this week's League Express. Connolly and Newlove were unbelievable. They were perfect centres. They were both just perfect centres, and I think the game doesn't produce players like those two anymore. They were just phenomenal, and I actually think they were basically not far off Hall of Fame level, but just don't really sort of get the raps. Because they weren't halfbacks or they weren't finishers like Martyn Sadler, but Gary Connolly is probably the most underrated rugby league player. Just a sensational defensive player, but brilliant going forward as well, incredibly strong. I used to love watching him play.
Yeah, great. Is there any other players you'd like to touch on before we sort of wrap it up here today?
I really enjoyed the interview with Phil and Declan Roberts from the wheelchair team, because I'm a very recent convert. I've been to the first game I ever went to was the World Cup final. I mean, that's just jumping on a bandwagon, really, isn't it? So I went to that, and then I thought, well, I want to push this a bit further. So I went to their house in Orrell and just asked them a whole bunch of questions about wheelchair rugby league, and they were great. So they actually both won the wheelchair World Cup. Declan last year and Phil in 2008. So a father and son who both won the World Cup. I found that really interesting. The guys from the 60s, Colin Clark, very funny interview, but also very, very, very serious in places. He was great to talk to. Ray Ashby, likewise, talking endlessly about the 65 Cup final when he was joint man of the match. I can honestly say I enjoyed them all, and I hope that comes through in the book.
Yeah, perfect. And just a reminder, if you are interested in purchasing this book, you can head online to the Total RL website, www.totalrl.com/shop, or you can call 01484 401 895 to secure your copy. When can everyone come and see you for that signing at Wigan?
Yes, that's Friday the 1st of September, before Wigan play Salford.
Perfect. So head along there, guys. I'm sure Richard will welcome any Wigan fans that want to come and have a chat. Any last word from you, Martyn?
No, I'm delighted that we're publishing the book, Jake, and I hope it goes really well. I'm sure it will do, and I think Wigan fans will really enjoy reading it. It's going to be a great book for them, buying it as a present. If you've got a partner who's a Wigan fan, you'll do them a great favour by buying this book and giving them some nights of great pleasure reading it, I think.
Last thing I want to say, actually, is how good is the front cover? And that's I'm not a designer. I don't have any artistic ability whatsoever, but it was knocked together by Stephen Ibbotson, who works for League Express. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah,
I love what he's done with the cover. I said to him, look, can you try and get all the players on the cover? And I couldn't quite imagine how he'd do it, but it's just brilliant, I think.
Yeah.
No, fantastic.
Stunning piece of artwork.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for that compliment for Stephen, Richard.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Richard. Can't wait to see it published and hopefully in everyone's bookshelves. So, yeah, look forward to also having you on in the future.
No problem.
Forward, mate.
No problem, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thanks, guys.